thank you very much for coming. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to Andres Carvalho for the invitation to be involved in this wonderful event. My name is Rebecca Taylor, and by way of introduction, as Emily mentioned, I am currently serving as an executive in residence and director of the microelectronics portfolio at the Austin Technology Incubator. My good friend Tom Singer mentioned a few things about ATI, so I won't repeat what he said. But I will say that over the years, ATI has built a variety of portfolios of startups, and 600 to 800 companies later, if you go to the ATI homepage, you will find that the economic impact of a whole lot of mentors, many of whom or most of whom are pro bono, is on the order of $3.5 billion of the companies that have been started and their impact on Central Texas. So currently, ATI is in the middle of building a microelectronics incubator focus in partnership with the Defense Department. And I will be around for the next hour or so after the panel. I'm happy to talk to anybody that wants to learn more about what ATI is doing. By way of sharing something that's going on in early December that ATI is involved in, you might want to mark your calendars for December 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Because right here in Austin, Texas is going to be an extremely large conference involving all of the funders from all of the various departments of the U.S. government, and starting with but not ending with the Defense Department. And there also will be a large focus on SBIR, companies looking to learn more about how to do it, fill out an SBIR, workshops and so forth. But the 3rd, 4th, and 5th, it's at the JW Marriott. It's called the Defense Innovation Summit, and the organization that is primarily organizing that in partnership with ATI is called Tech Connect. And again, I'm happy to fill you in if you want to learn more about that. So I am a retired computer scientist. I grew up in the 80s when nothing had been done yet, and so building embedded real-time systems. And so I've been fascinated by what's been going on in the last couple of years in this space. And chiefly, how many of you guys know what Hot Chips is? The Hot Chips Conference. So I was fortunate enough to go to that a couple of weeks ago. It was held on the campus at Stanford. And there were 1,019 chip designers in attendance at this. If anybody wanted to really have an impact on the U.S. government, all they had to do was go to that one building and they could have taken out most of our chip design skill sets. There were another 1,000 people logged in remotely, and they were all sharing what they're doing in two areas: power management and heat management, as it's driven by the demands of AI applications. I heard several things that blew my mind, but I'll share one or two of them with y'all. These folks that are designing processors for the next generation of AI applications are having to deal with 1 trillion parameter data sets, and how do they move those in and out of a processor fast and without generating quite so much heat. The second thing is there was an entire day of tutorials on how to deal with heat, and everything from the data center down to inside your average processor chip. And what do we do about all that heat? And Sandeep did a marvelous job of summarizing why that's important to think about. So again, if anybody's interested in what else was learned at Hot Chips, it was the most open exchange of information from leading chip architects from every single company. AMD had people there. There were at least 50 chip designers from NVIDIA. IBM was represented, Intel's design teams were there, everybody. I can't imagine being an IP attorney working for any of those companies and having to go over that presentation that they were each giving, because it was seriously open kimono, talking about how they're tackling these problems in the area of power and performance. So with that, I'm going to turn my attention to our panelists, who are recognized experts in the whole arena of edge and sensor technologies, as well as several other things. And Eric, I'm going to ask each one of them to introduce themselves. And Eric and I'm going to get your last name, Hensbergen, thank you, is a fellow at ARM, Advanced Risk Machines. Prior to that, he was at IBM Research, and prior to that, he was a member of technical staff at Lucent. So we're extremely fortunate to have, and thank you, Andres, for arranging this, such a wonderful expert on a huge range of technologies, but we're going to zero in on edge and sensors today. And then sitting next to him is Vibhu Sharma, who is maybe the newest resident of Austin.
Yes, correct.
Just moved here, is it Saturday?
Correct.
Yeah. And your son just started grade school today?
Correct as well.
Yeah, so, please a round of applause for our newest resident.
Thank you.
So Vibhu is with a company that I am looking forward to getting more familiar with, LT Semiconductors. They are an Indian chip design firm, and I believe Sandeep and Vibhu are colleagues at this company. And so we're going to do our very best to perhaps expand on some of the things that Sandeep raised in our comments. But Vibhu is the CTO of LT Semiconductor, and he has had a very interesting career prior to that. And so I'll let him go into that if he wants to. What I'd like to launch after we allow them to do an introduction, I'd like to launch into a discussion of what edge computing is and why it's happening that we're looking at this now. And as a framing, I'm going to put out there that 30 years ago in the real-time process control arena, we were looking at a very similar situation where we had a lot of advanced computing capability that was being aimed at process control situations, and there was a move afoot architecturally to move the smarts in the system out to the field sensors, and it was a standard called field bus. Well, I don't think field bus took off, and so I'm kind of curious 30 years later what the imperatives and the financial drivers and the technology drivers are that have us once again talking about edge computing. So if you could, for those of us that don't know as much about this as you do, if you could tell us what edge computing is and why we're looking at this now, I think that would be a great way to launch the discussion. So, Vibhu, do you want to go first?
Sure. It will take me some time to explain the context, why this is different this time. What you see is the assets around in the world, like your objects, which are mechanical. But what we have been seeing that those mechanical objects took a form of a cyber-physical system, thanks to the affordable computing, affordable sensing, and the rise of the semiconductors. So these assets have been transformed to some sort of a data assets, which are connected. They collect the data, they transform the data into the insights, which drive the businesses, the real economic in the world. Now, if you ask me to summarize this whole complex mechanism or orchestration from the raw sensing to the intelligent insight, which changes your life, my life, is driven by the 3 Ds, what I say: the dependability, the decarbonization, and the digitalization. And you cannot have these 3 Ds without having the digitization close to where the physical world is. With decarbonization, I mean to say energy efficiency. So how your orchestration has to be organized so that your energy efficiency is of the highest order. How you are going to make it dependable, that you are able to manage it well, no one is hacking into it. All your convenience doesn't become the inconvenience or you become a sitting duck. And your decarbonization and dependability taken care of, digitization, what my CEO just described, the need of the sensors. It increases the sensors to feed into the virtuous cycle of the data into the insight. What we all say or know is a data and AI virtuous cycle. More data drives a demand for sophisticated AI algorithms. More sophisticated AI algorithms substantiate the need of more data, more sensors, but at the same time also means at each sensor level, we talk about the greater granularity, the better signal to noise ratio, the more channel counts. Also, we talk about the early digitization to fit into your bigger scheme of things, that I am able to update my assets through the OTAs. So this is the mega trend which we are seeing is getting manifested in the form of plethora of the applications. If we talk about 20, 30 years ago, from the mainframe PC world to the laptops to the smartphones. The smartphones is the first such example which comes to top of my mind, where this mechanism has transformed to some mundane device with just a voice communication to plethora of things. Now, smartphone is more than just talking, a lot more things. A bank, thing to call your taxi, a thing to settle other transactions, things like that. Then what we see in the last decade, the same mechanism coming to your car, Your car doesn't become just like a mechanical car with a lot of moving parts, but now become a sophisticated object with lot lesser moving parts, but at the same time is becoming like a data on wheel, becoming like a, you name it, people have so many names around it. And slowly you will see this trend coming to a lot of other things. It's already coming, but not getting visible because of the B2B nature. For example, if you visit the latest factories in most of the advanced countries, they don't require many workers. There's a digital twin involved there. Similarly, what the example my CEO told about energy, the same thing is happening, but at a different pace. But the trend remains the same, that we are looking for decarbonization, digitization, and dependability as a society. And that's where the common denominator of edge computing, sensing, semiconductors based solution becomes very vital.
Terrific. Thank you. Eric?
So ARM, which is the company that I work for, has been at the center of embedded and many of these technologies, mobile in particular, right? Where 98% of cell phones are running ARM-based processors. Where things are going with edge is really fascinating. And I think it was set up in the previous talk, great, right? The AI revolution needs data. Sensors are going to be the heart of that data. Where we're at in a lot of systems today with sensors is all that data gets backhauled to the cloud. That costs a tremendous amount of power, right? Just think about all your Ring cameras and your home security cameras and the business cameras, and all of that is getting backhauled to a data center for processing and storage and whatnot. And that creates a tremendous glut of data. And as these sensors become more and more complicated, as they become richer in the amount of data they're providing, that data use just goes up. So what's really driving edge computing is that data deluge, as they call it. Lots of D words. I didn't even go in your D word. It's this data deluge that we're facing. And increasingly, the way to approach that is to move the intelligence closer to the sensor. And this can happen at all different scales. So you can have microcontrollers now have been given vector processing capabilities so that they can run the first stages of ML workloads, to do the first stages of filtering, so that they notice when something interesting is happening and only backhaul data when it's relevant. So, you can see this very typically and somewhat frustratingly for many people still in wake word detection. When you say, hey, Alexa, hey, Google, Siri, whatever, that wake up is programmed in almost at a microcontroller level for power reasons. You don't want to run complex recognition routines on everything that thing's hearing. You only want to trigger it off of wake word detection, and that can happen at the microcontroller level very efficiently. And then those can, when they get that or they see something interesting, like in an industrial control system, if you start to see a vibration that looks different than the vibration you're used to, you can wake up another system to then go analyze in more detail that data. And then this creates a power efficiency thing that makes everything much more sustainable as a technology. And that's really the heart of edge. It's really about moving that intelligence from central controlling platforms out closer to the sensor or integrated with the sensor so that you can save power. It also helps with low latency when you're dealing with real time. You don't want to have to pay a round trip time when what you're doing is something safety critical, like self-driving cars or whatever, right? That needs to happen at the device or as close to the devices as possible. And then that can also feed into allaying privacy and confidentiality concerns, in that what's being upstreamed isn't videos of you inside your house, but it's just general information of there's a person in this room, turn on the lights, sort of metadata. And so there's a bunch of these different concerns that edge computing help ameliorate. And then the other aspect that you get out of it that's a great advantage is the edge is a distributed system. So instead of having to concentrate all of that computing power in a data center where it's much denser and much more difficult to run power into it and to cool it, Now you can distribute some of those power concerns around where it's much more easy to deal with from a power delivery perspective and a thermal dissipation perspective. So a bunch of these things factor in together. But I think the thing that's really interesting, and I think you touched on this a little bit, is we're seeing a platformification of the edge. And one of the projects that I've been involved in, which was a Smarter Cities project run out of University of Chicago and Northwestern, where they branded it Sensors as a Service. And they had smarter city pods with a whole host of sensors and a whole host of AI processing capabilities within this box that could be hung on street corners and be used to monitor traffic, monitor weather patterns, monitor environmental change. And they had NSF grants where there's 3,000 of these things deployed all over the US and in some places globally. And they're doing all the processing locally so that the only thing that's upstreamed is a very small amount of telemetry data to their central systems for secondary processing. And this isn't just a single application. It's actually a platform where they have a whole app store of AI applications that can be deployed to make use of these sensors. And so different scientists can construct experiments and deploy. And in some cases, you can even discover things that's more emergent. So for example, when the volcano went off in the South Pacific and created a pressure wave that, circled the globe twice because it was such a big explosion, we went and looked at the telemetry of all of our pods spread out over the US that we could actually see both pressure waves in the telemetry data from the pods. Distributed over time. So we saw when it hit California, and then like a half an hour later, it hit Chicago. And around that same time, it hit Austin. And then we saw it come around again. So it's really fascinating, really interesting opportunities to advance science. But all of these things are going to become much more prevalent across domains as we move more into this edge era.
Wow. I'm going to take a moment to kind of absorb all that. So three things occur to me in these three different topics. One is security, because you're putting all this stuff out there on millions of teeny tiny little platforms. Second is cost. And the third one, which I wasn't thinking of until just now, might be the next one we want to talk about, and that is power. So are we looking at a billion different little wires running power to things, or are we talking about a lot of batteries, or is it solar, or what? How do you actually get power to these? Because they got to have, even if it's milliwatts, they've got to have a little bit of power to do what they do.
That's one of the most toughest question for the world to solve. There are some things happening, what you see with the Xi Alliance for your smartphone for wireless charging, which is the closest thing it comes to get rid of the wires. But at the same time, you also see that bringing this technology to the wider scope has been tried number of times, long before even when I went to an engineering schools where people tried using a high frequency microwave to transmit energy or electricity. What's currently is required is an orchestration between the different stakeholders in the ecosystem. It cannot be a proprietary thing, and that's where the role of standardization comes into picture. If especially we want to get rid of the wires, there has to be the unified standard for energy transmission. It's happening in some of the areas, but not in all the industry segments. And you also have to realize that what you see today is getting wired was something not trivial probably 6, 7 decades ago. It led to a lot of standardization efforts. So the first hurdle I see is the lack of standards and the unified approach. Now, getting rid of batteries, scientifically, we can think of energy harvesting. There are solutions like triboelectricity where you charge the things, but currently they are not at the state of the art where it can power some of the applications which we want to see. They are limited to rather very smaller or niche applications to showcase the power of the concept. But to the practical reality, I think we have to work more.
So I agree. Like a lot of this will depend on the application that you're trying to go after. But one of the things that some of my colleagues had done was, as part of a DARPA program, they built an energy harvesting sensor that actually did wake word detection. So it wasn't just doing sensing; it was sensing and able to do enough ML to do wake word detection completely off of harvested energy. and they actually had 3 different modes of harvested energy, if I remember correctly. They had a solar version. They had a version that worked purely on vibration, where it would charge up a capacitor enough to be able to burst radio transmission that it detected a wake word. And then there was another that was more like a wind-based vibration energy harvesting. And so that's an extreme example, a very extreme example, but this was one of these, size of a grain of sand microprocessors hooked up to a sensor engagement. So it is possible, and those technologies continue to develop. But I think even at the higher end, you can get away with quite a lot with solar and wind. Some of these same sensors that I was talking about from my colleagues in Chicago, they're now using to deploy for wildfire detection and for environmental change. And all of those locations are remote, and they're able to power those units purely off of solar and wind with a small battery reserve. So I think, and that's doing much more complicated AI processing. Those are full-fledged GPUs in those systems, and they're able to actually power them with a single solar panel. So the technologies come quite far in being able to drive some of these things. And I think we just need to kind of continue to push into that area of looking at different sustainable technologies and looking at very aggressive power controls and management, so that we can conserve the power that we have when we're harvesting it in these scenarios.
Yeah, what I like the approach with my colleague here is that we have moved in certain directions, but what we need to look is not only eliminating the battery, but how we are going to optimize the overall energy equation. What we sense, what we process, where we process. Is it processing for my system more expensive, or the data transmission? That can already solve a lot of low-hanging fruit problems in many of the application areas, and I agree with the approach mentioned by Eric.
So do you have an opinion on whether, from an energy budget perspective, if you move a piece of functionality that was handled more centrally and push it out to the sensor level, out in the field somewhere, is the energy budget to do that same operation higher or lower once you push it out?
I'll give you a very good example. So let's say that you take a camera sensor. So you have a camera sensor, 8 megapixel, 60 frames or 30 frames per second, true color, 24 bits. Now, if you want to have that sensor just like gathering the data and transmitting the data over the network and let your central processor process it, you do the math, what it takes the most. It's going to be a raw data transmission on the wires, not the processing. Now, there's a smart sensor guy, he says, why I need to transfer all the frames from my processing? Can I manage it to just extract the features from my scene and do the feature transformation? Then you spend some energy at the sensor, you optimize a lot on the transmission, and you leave the job of the classification for central processors. And then the third scenario that you take even one step further, you say is that, do my sensor need to extract everything from the scene for my edge to process it, or should I have an even more smart sensor which just detected the changes in the scene? So this is a kind of an equation we need to balance. Technically, it could be one answer, but at the same time, your other parameters come into the decision making, your robustness, your cost, your supply chain objectives. So that makes it quite a complex Pareto curve analysis to be done.
Right. Which leads me to the cost question. Because often if you're putting more functionality out in the field, that's going to probably drive up the cost, not necessarily, but probably. So do you have a feel for whether at the end of the day, for, again, a given function, once you push things out into the field, does it become less expensive somehow?
So, I mean, I think it depends. Everything depends on the situation, of course, right? But if you look at what, let's say, NVIDIA is driving into data centers for dense processing for machine learning, like their Grace Hopper or now their Grace Blackwell systems. These are incredibly complex pieces of machinery that are able to process tons of data, but they're also incredibly expensive. And part of that is a density situation. Data center real estate ends up being an expensive commodity. and even more so when you have to deal with power delivery and cooling in all of these different places. So if that one system is consolidating 100,000 streams from cameras, remote cameras, is that going to be cheaper to buy and operate one of those, or is it going to be cheaper to have this sort of smart sensing technology on each of the cameras doing as much of the processing local as possible? That ends up to be a much simpler. You don't need a Grace Blackwell per camera. You need something much simpler. And in fact, even NVIDIA has these smaller Tegra boxes that are meant for smart cameras. It does the same type of processing, but now does it in a distributed manner, so you don't need that dense consolidation. And I think if you look historically at computing in general, this is kind of like this. We were talking about cycles earlier. This is the mainframe versus client desktop computing model all over again. It's much more economical to have everybody have a laptop than to have everyone share a gigantic mainframe, because that consolidation has economic benefits in some ways, but at the other side, it drives that computational density and that cost associated with it much higher because of the technology that's necessary to accommodate it there.
Yeah, the challenge is it's your cost, my cost, or the ecosystem cost. That's where the complexity lies. You don't want to lampoon the balloon to shift the air at somewhere else. That could be a very good success story for your cost, but you have shifted a problem for someone else. That's a problem.
Okay, so probably a larger topic, Andres, for a future conference is how do you figure out how to apportion those costs to the right place? Yes. And that leads me to security as another broad question about the decision to push functionality out into the field, into a physically probably less secure place, but I think the jury's out as to whether centralization, it makes it more straightforward to protect things, or more difficult, and how we strike that balance in this as we push, because we will push, I think, towards putting more and more capabilities out on the edge.
It's not even just the physical access possibilities, which is certainly a problem on the edge, but it's also just a question of keeping all of those distributed systems up to date with all the most recent security patches and everything else, so that they don't become a giant botnet. Now, one of the things that we've pushed quite heavily for is certifiable standards around this. So we had the platform security architecture in ARM, which specifically targeted at the IoT and edge, where you had different certification levels on signing up to how you keep those systems up to date and how you keep the secrets and the data on those systems secure, just to create a awareness of what systems were providing and what they needed to provide in order to maintain the security when you were at the edge. And that program has been quite successful. And in fact, in a lot of the discussions with the government, where they're talking about regulating these things, both here in the US, in the UK, and in Europe, they've come to us and asked us about our platform security architecture standards, and how those might be applied from a regulatory perspective.
Yeah, regulation certainly helps, and I agree with Eric on that. In particular areas, it has certainly proven to be very successful. But what we see is a challenge where security is not one size fits all. You can have a perfectly standardized solution for a certain application, and when you translate that platform to another one, that's where you see the shortcomings. Now, in our newly entity in LNT, what we are trying to do when it comes to security is we are taking a system-first approach. Depending on your system, threat model, and the level of protection it requires, we determine the kind of solution it requires, and we categorize it depending on the scenarios. And what we also see, a duration of your assets. Like if your phone is something you change 1 and 2 or 3 years, depending where you are, car maybe 5, 7 years. Especially in the critical infrastructure, these things remain in the field for over 15, 20, perhaps even 3 decades. And in that scenario, you can't ignore the fact of the post-quantum cryptography or post-quantum security becoming very relevant, which was some sort of more of a research innovation topic half a decade ago, but not anymore. And how can I design my secure system, which I know once leave my boundary or physical limitation of my company out in a field, could stay there for 2 decades, 3 decades. If a hack happens, it spoils my brand name of my company. It does impact all other products. That's where the agility comes into picture, not only installing the assets, but how I have to maintain it with the regular maintenance in the form of updates necessarily required for that certain application. That's where the security, in my opinion, takes a slightly more complicated form than many of the other things we just talk about.
Sounds like full employment act for a whole lot of people. So I think we're to time. Do we have time for one question if anybody wants to ask one? I know we're. Anybody have a question out there? Everybody wants coffee. All right. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for making
Thank you.
time. It's been wonderful. Hey, let's give a round of applause.